I want to get everyone to the table and start making real movement on this. Delays cannot continue. The core issue is visible when you look at the full range of goods under tariffs, including steel, automobiles, dairy, and forestry. That alone represents nearly $7 billion in exposure. Keep that number in mind because it will look very different by the end of this picture. Here's what unfolded. On Monday, June 29th, only hours before one of the most critical deadlines in the history of the Canada-United States trade relationship, Ontario Premier Doug Ford met with Utah Governor Spencer Cox. In that meeting, they quietly finalized an agreement. It was not announced from Washington, and there was no public moment alongside Donald Trump. Instead, it was a direct province-to-state arrangement aimed at strengthening Ontario-Utah trade ties outside the federal tariff confrontation that has dominated the last 18 months. The timing matters. The following day, July 1st, Canada Day, the formal review process for the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement began. While Ottawa and Washington prepared for what many see as the most significant trade negotiation in decades, a provincial leader had already stepped into a parallel channel, working directly with a U.S. state leadership just before the federal process officially opened. For Canadians, the impact is not abstract. It reaches into production costs, purchasing prices, and employment in communities tied to industrial activity. The underlying story goes beyond a single agreement signed in Salt Lake City. Canada's export structure has long been defined by one central reality. Roughly 75% of all exports go to the United States. That level of concentration means that every tariff decision, every policy shift, and every political escalation in Washington directly affects Canadian industry. For decades, this was treated as a stable condition rather than a vulnerability. What is changing now is the approach. That dependence is increasingly being treated as something to reduce rather than accept. Building relationships at the state level is part of a broader strategy to diversify exposure away from federal-level volatility. The Utah Agreement is not isolated, it is part of a sequence. Since 2023, Ontario has signed similar cooperation arrangements with 10 American states. These include Indiana, Michigan, Nevada, Illinois, New Jersey, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and now Utah. The South Carolina deal had only been signed a week earlier. This pattern accelerated after renewed trade tensions intensified. The scale of Ontario-Utah trade is not minor. It reached nearly $7 billion in 2025. That relationship alone accounts for about 70% of Canada's trade with Utah. The agreement focuses on sectors such as critical minerals, defense-related manufacturing, and advanced technologies. It also intersects with growing interest in nuclear power development, including large-scale reactors and small modular reactor systems, as electricity demand rises across several U.S. states. In recent remarks, Ford suggested that political pressure on the U.S. president was increasing, referencing a Supreme Court decision that weakened legal support for certain tariff measures. His positioning indicates a belief that leverage is shifting, and that timing matters in how subnational deals are pursued. This Utah trip was his third visit to the United States in a single month, showing a pattern of direct engagement rather than waiting for federal outcomes. This is no longer a one-time diplomatic gesture. It is a structured effort to build parallel trade channels that persist regardless of who controls the White House. The broader implication is that provincial actors are increasingly operating alongside, rather than inside, federal trade negotiations. At the same time, developments in Ottawa add another layer. Mark Carney's federal approach is moving in a different but complementary direction. Since taking office, his administration has signed around 20 new trade agreements spanning multiple regions across the world within less than a year. A central objective has been set, doubling Canada's non-U.S. exports by 2035. One of the major initiatives includes an effort to establish a free trade agreement with India. Both sides are targeting an increase in bilateral trade toward $50 billion by 2030, compared with approximately $9 billion today. Carney has described the current period as a structural break in the old model of Canada-U.S. economic integration. In his framing, the previous system is no longer functioning in its original form. That perspective reflects a broader shift in strategy. It suggests that Canada cannot negotiate effectively from a position of strength while remaining heavily dependent on a single trading partner. Expanding global trade relationships is being treated as a structural necessity rather than an optional policy direction. His background in central banking is evident in the way this strategy is being implemented. Federal-level diversification efforts and provincial-level cross-border deals are operating in parallel, forming a combined response to the changing trade environment. Mark Carney builds economic off-ramps beyond the United States, extending toward Europe, Asia, and India. At the same time, provincial leaders like Doug Ford secure state-level partnerships that can persist, regardless of which president is in office. This is not Ford acting independently in isolation. It is a broader national effort to strengthen leverage that previously did not exist in this form. But the key question remains, who actually bears the cost of tariffs introduced under Trump's policy direction? Tariffs are not paid at the border by the exporting country. Instead, They are paid by importers inside the United States. When duties are imposed on Canadian steel or aluminum, it is American manufacturers who face higher costs first. Those expenses then move through supply chains and are ultimately reflected in products such as trucks, appliances, and construction projects in U.S. cities. This complicates the assumption that Canada is the only economy under pressure. The burden is shared across the system. However, there is another layer that must also be acknowledged. Canadian exports to the United States declined by about 5.8% over the past year. That contraction contributed to slowing Canadian economic growth to roughly 1.7%, marking the weakest expansion since the contraction experienced in 2020. These are real impacts affecting multiple industries. At the same time, goods that comply with Cusma rules have largely been exempt from the most severe tariff measures. As a result, Canada has maintained one of the lowest effective tariff rates among countries targeted under Trump's trade actions. Both pressure and partial protection are occurring simultaneously. Understanding this requires tracing the chain of effects. Tariffs introduce cost increases and, more importantly, uncertainty. That uncertainty discourages long-term investment in export-driven economies. It forces a reassessment of reliance on a single dominant customer, especially when that customer accounts for 3/4 of export activity. This pressure has produced two parallel responses. One is Carney's expansion into global markets. The other is the development of provincial-level agreements with U.S. states. Together, these approaches change negotiation dynamics by increasing Canada's flexibility and reducing dependency on a single path. With alternative trade routes available, negotiation positioning shifts. A country with multiple external options behaves differently from one with limited alternatives. As Canada enters the July 1st review process, its leverage is shaped not only by immediate demands, but also by the number of economic pathways it has established in advance. The United States Trade Representative has publicly criticized Canada for increasing engagement in global markets, while the United States attempts to scale back its own exposure. This criticism is directed particularly at Carney's outreach to Europe and Asia. The reaction signals that Washington is not ignoring these moves, but responding to them. At this point, the discussion moves beyond surface agreements and tariff numbers. It also includes the structure of strategy itself and how different parts of it interact. The emerging framework, sometimes described as Fortress North America, introduces a more integrated continental approach. Doug Ford has tested variations of this concept over time. It suggests a tighter economic and security alignment between Canada and the United States, particularly in relation to competition from China. However, this framing also creates constraints. It implies that Canada's value within the system depends on alignment with U.S. economic security priorities. That includes matching tariff positions on Chinese imports and operating within a shared protective structure. This creates tension with Canada's simultaneous effort to present itself as an open and diversified trading nation. Maintaining both narratives at the same time becomes increasingly difficult as they expand in different directions. A comparison with Mexico highlights a different approach. Facing similar tariff pressures, President Sheinbaum pursued a strategy centered on quiet de-escalation, limited concessions, and lower-profile diplomatic engagement. This approach helped avoid the most severe tariff escalations. Canada chose a different path. Its response has been more direct, including stronger public statements from Carney and Ford, as well as visible trade messaging campaigns that, at one point, contributed to stalled negotiations. Despite these differences, Canada is also investing heavily in industrial policy, export capacity, infrastructure development, and domestic procurement strategies. The key lesson from previous trade disputes is that diversification only becomes effective when it begins before pressure peaks. In Canada's case, the timing is still under evaluation. A critical argument against these strategies is that many of the state-level agreements are memorandums of understanding rather than binding treaties. They do not eliminate federal tariff authority. The decisive leverage still rests in federal negotiations scheduled for the July 1st review, where outcomes will be shaped by national leaders rather than provincial or state-level agreements. Ontario's opposition has been direct about this. The interim Liberal leader has described these cross-border trips as political theater, aimed more at voters at home than at delivering real outcomes. In that view, the Premier should be focused on core domestic issues, such as schools, hospitals, and healthcare within Ontario. That criticism carries weight. A handshake in Utah does not reduce steel prices in Hamilton overnight. There's also a fair counterpoint on the American side. One can argue that Trump's tariff pressure has forced Canada to confront a long-standing dependence it had avoided addressing for decades. If the intention was to shock Canada out of economic complacency, then that objective has largely been achieved. The acceleration of diversification strategies, state-level agreements, and industrial planning was not occurring at this pace before tariffs intensified. In that sense, part of Canada's current resilience has emerged because external pressure forced adaptation. The pressure campaign itself became a catalyst for change. However, the skeptical argument also faces limits. Symbolic economic relationships still matter. These state-level agreements create domestic constituencies inside the United States. Governors, businesses, and workers develop direct interests in maintaining cross-border trade flows. Canada remains the top trading partner for more than 30 American states. When tariff policies are discussed in Washington, those state leaders often respond directly because their own economies are affected. The memorandums of understanding do not remove tariffs directly, but they create political resistance to new tariff measures, making future escalation more difficult. This represents slower, indirect leverage, but it is still leverage being accumulated over time. At this point, the situation becomes a dual-track strategy under scrutiny. On one side, there is federal-level negotiation. On the other, there is a growing network of state-level agreements. Ontario's opposition questions whether these efforts are meaningful or largely symbolic. The central structure becomes clearer when both tracks are combined. Nearly $7 billion in trade between Ontario and Utah is not an isolated figure. It functions as part of a broader pattern across 10 American states. The agreement signed just before the federal review begins signals a coordinated message that Canada is not economically cornered. On July 1st, Canada, the United States, and Mexico enter a critical decision phase under the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement framework. 3 possible paths emerge. One option is full renewal of the agreement for another 16 years, extending stability through 2042, preserving a trade system worth approximately $1.7 trillion annually. A second option is partial withdrawal by one party, which would not immediately terminate the agreement but would begin a long transition toward expiration in 2036, creating a prolonged period of uncertainty. A third option involves continuous annual reviews, producing ongoing renegotiation pressure and sustained instability in the framework. Each outcome carries direct consequences for key sectors, including automobiles, groceries, electronics, lumber, and pharmaceuticals. If the agreement remains stable, prices are expected to remain relatively steady. If it weakens, cost increases would appear unevenly, but clearly across consumer goods, housing projects, and transportation costs. Employment exposure in trade-dependent industries would also increase uncertainty. This is not abstract policy. It translates directly into household budgets and industrial stability over the next 18 months. Looking ahead, 6 to 12 months, the most likely scenario is an initial review without immediate resolution. A renewal with stricter rules of origin is probable, along with targeted adjustments in sectors such as steel and dairy. However, certain tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles remain outside the formal agreement structure, meaning they could persist even under a broader deal. At the same time, state-level agreements are expected to continue expanding. Doug Ford is already engaging with Western U.S. governors, and Utah's governor has encouraged other states to pursue similar arrangements. This parallel track is likely to grow regardless of federal negotiation outcomes. From the American perspective, tariff pressure has contributed to a broader discussion about supply chain security and reliance on external manufacturing, particularly in relation to China. From the Canadian perspective, the economic cost has been significant, including measurable declines in exports and slower growth. Yet another reality is emerging alongside those costs. Canada, which once relied heavily on a single trading partner, is now actively building alternative pathways. It is developing external markets, strengthening internal coordination, and establishing economic ties within the United States at the state level. A country that once absorbed external pressure passively is now constructing multiple exit routes while simultaneously entering major negotiations with more leverage than it held 2 years earlier. The Utah agreement, signed just hours before the federal review began, becomes symbolic of that shift without needing to be stated directly. The central conclusion remains unsettled. These state-level agreements may be viewed as strategic leverage building or as symbolic gestures with limited immediate impact. What remains clear is that Canada is no longer relying on a single economic channel. The coming decisions will determine whether this dual strategy becomes a long-term framework or remains an interim response to pressure. Call to action. The next phase of this trade relationship will define the structure of North American economics for years. Watch closely how federal negotiations and state-level agreements interact, because the outcome will shape pricing, industry stability, and cross-border trade well beyond this cycle. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.